Today, we continue on with our sermon and worship series about the 10 essential stories in the Bible. And today we're really talking about probably one of the most quintessential stories in all of the New Testament. There actually aren't very many stories that find their way in each of the four Gospels. There's a crucifixion, there's a resurrection, there's a baptism, and then there's this. These are the four stories that make it in each one of the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Not the nativity, not the miracle of walking on water or calming the storm. There isn't the fig tree or any of those stories that we might know. But these are the four stories: baptism, crucifixion, resurrection, and the feeding of the 5,000. So this is the very quintessential story of the early Christian church, and it continues to speak to us here today. But even though the baptism, the crucifixion, and the resurrection are also found in the four Gospels, actually the details of those stories among the four Gospels actually don't really match up sometimes. And the little idiosyncrasies of each are such that you can kind of see that, well, maybe there were different variations that were floating around the early church. But the story and the details of the feeding of the 5,000 are pretty consistent regardless of whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And it's not just found in the four canonical Gospels. Actually, there are four apocryphal or Gnostic Gospels out there that also include the feeding of the 5,000 within their books. And even the apocryphal Syriac Acts of John actually places this story in such a prominent place that it's the very last miracle and the culmination of Jesus' earthly ministry right before his crucifixion. Everything else kind of leads up to this miracle. That's how it is important it is in the Syriac Acts of John. But Paul mentions this story in his letters to the churches in the Near East and in the Mediterranean world. There are so many other miracles and other teachings and other stories that Paul could pull from. But this is the story, more often than not, that Paul mentions when he's talking to and encouraging a church in Galatia or in Corinth. And not just Paul, but the early church leader Clement of Alexandria in 3 epistles mentions this story. Now, many of you know what the ichthus is. It's that very classic symbol of the fish. And early on in the Christian world, whenever there was a house church or a place where Christians met, it was the symbol of the ichthus, which would designate that this was a place where Christians were meeting. There have been a number of excavations and archaeological sites that have been brought forth and discovered in Jerusalem and in Israel and Palestine over the last decade. One of them, the oldest church known in Jerusalem, was discovered about 15 years ago. And as they have gone in and looked inside of this church, do you find a cross? No. There's not a single cross in this church. It dates back to about the year 85 or 90. The dominant iconography and symbol in the earliest Christian church that we've ever found in the city of Jerusalem is a loaf of bread and a fish. And by the 3rd century, a myth and a legend had kind of risen up that a certain outcropping of rocks on the shore of the Sea of Galilee was the very place where Jesus gathered the people there and actually performed a miracle. And then when a prominent and let's say convert to the Christian faith who had a little deeper pockets had converted in the 4th century, a man named Josephus decided that he was going to sort of honor this conversion event in his life, and he was going to use some of his wealth to build a church. Did he build the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem? No. Did he build the Church of the Withered Fig Tree outside of Jerusalem? No. He built the very first Church of Loaves and Fishes right next to the rock outcropping on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And after Constantine, the emperor of Rome, converted to Christianity, and Christianity became the legal and official religion of the Roman Empire, the bishop of Constantinople sent what would be in that time millions and millions and millions of dollars to renovate that little chapel that Josephus had built on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And this very famous mosaic was built. The Church of the Loaves and Fishes, this mosaic, still there today, dates back to the 5th century. Even though the church has been through many iterations since the 5th century, and even about a decade ago, 2 arsonists tried to burn the church down, this mosaic survived. And indeed, a English-speaking newspaper in Jerusalem talked about how it was sort of a minor miracle that this mosaic has survived in such pristine condition all the way from the 5th century, surviving wars and crusades and arson. There's kind of tongue-in-cheek that this is in such pristine condition that maybe it doesn't actually date back to the 5th century like we say, but that's the tradition, and that's the minor miracle. So this symbol of loaves and fishes not only spoke to the early church, but it continues to speak to us today. It truly is the quintessential Christian story. So if that's the case, if it's found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the apocryphal Gospels, the writings of Paul, the writings of Clement, inspired a man to use his wealth to build a church, and then for Rome to use their wealth to build a cathedral, why is it that this story speaks so profoundly to them and to us today? I think the reason being, sisters and brothers, is because it is one of the easiest miracles to find yourself in. I have been in this game for almost 20 years. I've yet to see a blind person get their sight back. I've yet to see a paralytic be able to have full mobility. I've never seen a lightning storm cease at a word. I've never been able to walk on water. But I have witnessed time and time and time again how the miracle of feeding someone has changed and helped and been an answer to someone's prayer. This is the quintessential Christian story because it is the miracle that each and every one of us can participate in every single day of our lives. When the disciples wanted to get away and just go on a retreat and just share in some really good fellowship with some friends that they hadn't seen in a really long time, and this horde of people saw where they were going, and they got to the place before Jesus and the disciples did, and there were this multitude of people there. When Jesus saw the need, the story says of the people, that he had compassion upon them. Now notice the disciples weren't angry with this crew. It wasn't like they said that they shouldn't, that these people shouldn't get fed. It was like, send them away and let them take care of themselves. But Jesus turns to his disciples and says, you take care of them. And they said, well, we don't have anything. And Jesus says, look around. Everything you need to take care of the people who are in need around you is already in your midst. The disciples, they started to believe the gospel of scarcity. That false narrative brings about anxiousness and worry and fear. And when we are worried and when we are fearful, we circle the wagons and say we're only going to take care of our own. And when we are fearful and anxious, that is when we are most likely to lash out with violence. And Jesus has no time for the gospel of scarcity. He has no time for the gospel of fear. He's got no time for the gospel of anxiousness. But he's got all sorts of time for people who have been affected by the gospel of fear, scarcity, and anxiousness. And he says what breaks through that is a gospel of compassion, generosity, and abundance. And he says you can participate in that gospel. I always think that of like a guy, let's just say a guy, who saw Jesus and the disciples go off, and he was like, I'm gonna man, I have heard so much about this guy. I'm going to go see what he's like. And like the next day, he shows up at like the bar, and like his buddy's sitting there, and he's like, hey man, I didn't see you yesterday. What'd you do? He's like, hey, I went to go see this guy Jesus. And he's like, oh yeah, would you see anything cool? He's like, did you see like, I don't know, did you see like him like exercise legion? No. Did you see him like give sight back to a blind person? No. Did you see him wither a perfectly healthy fig tree to dust? No. Well, what'd you see? No, he gave us a tuna fish sandwich and told us to be nice to each other. Crucify him! Caroline Lewis, who is the professor of homiletics at Luther Seminary, says one of the things that is so striking about this miracle is that no one is excited about it. Jesus exorcises a demon and people go, whoa, and tell everybody they meet. He heals a blind person, gives them back their sight, and people can't stop talking about it. He feeds 5,000 people and no one says a word, because the sharing of food to someone who's hungry is such a minor miracle that happens all the time that we think that it doesn't mean anything. Bill and Melinda Gates give $2 billion to education, and it makes the front page of the New York Times, Washington Post, and The Guardian. You donate a backpack and school supplies to a bar at elementary, and no one cares. Except for the person, the kid, who got the backpack and the school supplies, or the new shoes, or the new shirt. And it was the answer to someone's prayer. Jesus says to his disciples, you take care of them. And they turn to him and say, how? And he says, use what you got. He used 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and it was enough to fill the bellies and the hearts of so many that it spilled over to fill 12 baskets, which is just a fancy Hebrew and Christian number to say it was enough left over to feed everybody. Jesus is inviting you through this essential story of our faith to participate in the gospel of generosity, love, and abundance, which diminishes and takes away the clouds of the gospel of scarcity, of fear, and of anxiousness. Won't you accept the invitation? You could be the answer to someone's prayer today. When you show up to a loved one's house who has lost a person in their lives with a casserole and a bottle of wine, that's sharing in loaves and fishes. And it's the answer to someone's prayer. When you're at a stoplight and you see a vet, homeless, who hasn't eaten and is beaten down by the summer sun, and you reach into your glove compartment and you give them a $15 gift certificate to KFC, that is the sharing of the loaves and fishes. When you're stuck on the 94 and your car overheats and you're waiting 2.5 hours for a tow truck to arrive and you don't arrive home until 9 p.m. last night, borrowing your friend's Mini Cooper because yours is now in the shop. And as you've been waiting on the side of the road for 2 hours under a 92-degree heat, haven't drank anything in 3 hours, and a lovely couple named John and Nancy walk across the street to the parking lot where your car is broken down and hand you a Gatorade and some Triscuits. It is loaves and fishes, and it's the answer to someone's prayer. It doesn't get any hoopla. It doesn't make any headlines, but it is the most powerful miracle that we can participate in, because it's the miracle of answering a person's prayer today. Won't you do it? Jesus is asking. Amen.